I'm well aware I'm between you and morning, afternoon tea and some sugar and some coffee, so we'll try and go through this as quickly as possible. But I'm Joyanne Manning. I lead the waste business and resource recovery business for Arup, who are a global international engineering consultancy. But actually, in terms of the circular economy, we are the knowledge partner for the built environment with the MacArthur Foundation. So it puts us into a unique position to talk about the sort of circularity in the built environment, which is actually really, really fundamental to the circular economy's success when you think about the construction sector. So when we think about construction, it's worth knowing that globally, the construction sector is basically generates 13% of the world's GDP, and it actually employs 7% of the world's working age population. And between now and 2050, we are going to put on this earth the same amount of infrastructure that we have put on the earth since day dot to now. So that's a really, really scary kind of prospect when you think about how much infrastructure and how much construction we are going to build over the next 35 years. And when we think of construction, it's not just a building site. Construction covers everything from the planning stage, what materials are used and required, construction methodology, operation considerations, the actual construction itself, but also then the operation and maintenance regime and the deconstruction. And that's really now where we're actually sort of embedded into this take, make, use and dispose model. So when we, and this next slide comes from a report that Arup produced with the MacArthur Foundation. When we think about the take, make, dispose approach, it results in actually the construction sector being one of the largest consumers of resource and raw materials in the world, and it's a major producer of waste and carbon emissions. And some of the key reference figures for the built environment is that 10 to 15% of all materials are wasted during construction, and I think that's a conservative figure. We actually don't use about 40% of our office space, so actually we have huge wastage within the actual buildings itself. We could be conserving so much more energy if we thought about actually sort of smart usage of buildings, and then actually globally about 54% of demolition materials are only recycled, and a huge amount go to landfill. And we saw this morning the figures for construction and demolition waste across Australia. It varies from state to state. South Australia has landfill bans. It does fantastically well. It's in the 80s. Queensland, where I live, is really sort of trying to get to 50. So we know that the construction sector is having huge impacts on the environment, and we actually so people like the World Economic Forum and other organisations are starting to bring this to light, and they're also sort of recognising the opportunity that the circular environment can bring to the whole sort of material usage. And we've seen these slides a number of times today. It was Rosanna had it earlier for the EU. Natalie sort of showed it earlier as well. But the UN Sustainable Development Goals are really recognising the fact that we actually only have one planet, we only have one Earth, and we have to think about how we are using it. Quite interesting. Last week, the EU released some interesting stats when they sort of did their refocus around climate change and material usage. And the EU themselves, I think, are using about 3 to 3.5 times more resources on a per capita basis. Luxembourg, little old Luxembourg, one of the richest nations in Europe, but on a per capita basis, they have theirs used up in 48 days. So as particularly the developed world, we are just using more than we are producing, and that we have, and this is not sustainable. And if we think about how much more infrastructure we need to use and we need to build over the next 35 years, it just can't be done if we continue on the same approach that we have done to date. So when we think of the circular economy, the key principles according to the MacArthur Foundation obviously are designing out waste and pollution, keeping products in their cycle as long as possible, but also regenerating natural systems. And when we look to this publication that Arup produced last year with the MacArthur Foundation, a number of these are then apparent in terms of, with regard to the built environment. So this report focused on the viewpoint of the circular economy from principles to practice from three key actors. It looked at it from the position of policymakers and governments. It looked at it from investors and bankers, and then it looked at people who actually build the construction, so developers and the actual construction sector themselves. And, they sort of came out with some sort of core circular economy functions that need to be embedded into the circular economy and the built environment. So things like, supporting human well-being and natural systems, maintain, continuous material cycles, and then integrated infrastructure systems. I'm aware that, we need to get through a bit, so I'm going to continue. So I'm going to the problem, that's sort of where we're at, and I just thought it would be useful now to sort of talk you through what are the opportunities and some really good examples that are happening across the world with regard to circularity in the built environment. So first of all, we've got circularity at infrastructure scale, and we have HS2 in the UK, which is High Speed Rail 2, and that is being designed to total circular principles. So at all times they are thinking about material usage, design principles, and reuse principles through the whole design process and the construction process for HS2. And then the second example, which I'm going to focus on now, is the MX3D bridge in Amsterdam, which is a new pedestrian bridge that is being constructed in Amsterdam, and it's actually going to be the first 3D printed bridge in the world. And it's absolutely fantastic. It's going to result in 65% less material usage than a standard designed and constructed bridge, and no wastage. And actually, if this works, we have a little video. So that's where it's at. Arup were co-designers on that project, and it is actually it has been installed at this stage. So it's a fantastic sort of future example of where we can go to with sort of modern techniques. Then when we look at it in terms of building at circularity at building scale, there are some really interesting examples with regard to this. The first one is actually the circular building, which Arup designed as part of London Design Week a couple of years ago. And then the other one is actually it's the Sky building in the UK, which is 90% timber. And when we look to the circular building, which Arup designed as part of London Design Week, it was a really interesting challenge, because one of the things that we had to do was we were looking at leasing materials rather than purchasing the materials, maximising off-site fabrication. We really wanted to select materials that were reused, remanufactured, and could be recycled. We need to avoid things like wet trades, because we need to think about its deconstruction as well as construction. Designing the fit out so that it could be interchangeable, it could be sort of have multi-usage, and then also in terms of its electrical system, it needed to be low voltage and off grid, and it facilitated future flexibility and ease of maintenance design. And it was highly successful, but the biggest challenge of the whole building when we took it down at the end of the design week was actually getting the materials back into the supply chain. challenging because the supply chain does, in a linear model, did not allow it to go back. So that was a fantastic example of what can be done in terms of construction, actually deconstruction, but actually then the reuse is what was really challenging with regard to it. Just in terms of the building, sorry, I'm losing my pages. It's all confused. This is the Sky building in the UK, which is in London, and it has been. It's a flexible workspace delivered in under a year, so really quick construction, owing to mainly prefabrication techniques and renewable source of energy, and it uses low VOC materials and has significant carbon savings. It's also got, like, internally, it's got huge adaptive fittings, creating lots of flexible spaces for maximum reuse. Okay, this is a future concept proposed in Tokyo, which is actually going to be a wooden skyscraper. So it's the idea of 90% of the building will actually be made out of timber and 10% steel. So future, in terms of having a carbon footprint, it basically has a zero carbon footprint in terms of the use of timber. And this is a really cool scheme that's out of the Netherlands, which is a material passport scheme. So this is the idea of actually sort of maximising information and data and providing that necessary information to allow full reuse and full recirculation of the material. So this is a publicly available platform that basically aims to eliminate waste by giving materials identity. So that's all for buildings. So then when we look to circularity at community scale, there are some really cool examples even in Australia. You've already heard from Darren this afternoon on the Yarrabella project in Queensland. But this first picture is actually the Oak Royal the Old Oak and Park Royal in West London, which is going to be a huge, massively planned community at the nexus of actually high-speed rail 2 and Crossrail. So this idea is that it's basically the first ever fully comprehensive study for a master plan that's applied full circular economy principles to every aspect of it. Now it's still only at master planning stage. One of the key ideas of this is actually shared ownership. So you actually won't buy, the idea is you wouldn't buy a 3-bedroom apartment, is that you would buy an opportunity to live in this master plan through your entire life and be able to morph into different sort of houses and buildings and homes that would adjust to your needs as you would go through. So you start off as on your own, you might get a studio, then you get married, you get a 1-bedroom, have 3 kids, you get 3 bedrooms as they go to uni, they hopefully disappear, you go back to your maybe your 2-bedroom, and then maybe end up in a kind of an aged care facility. So this sort of idea. As I said, in Australia, we have some really good examples of actually circularity at a community level. Obviously, the facility, there is the Queensland Lend-Lease facility, and then the FKG group in Toowoomba are proposing to build basically a circularity precinct to support technology. So we're starting to see this come in Australia as well. So then finally, I'm going to talk about circularity at a macro scale. So this is sort of talking about it sort of at a much sort of greater level. And obviously China is really leading the way in this space, and they have and I'll talk about that in a minute. But actually, more interestingly, is that most recently there was a Circular Economy Pacific Summit held in Rotorua last month, and this was held by the MacArthur Foundation and the New Zealand Ministry of Environment, and it talked about the really massive opportunity that the Pacific has to embed circular economy principles. First of all, because of its full alignment actually with Maori and Pacifica culture and values, but also because there's a unique set of challenges that the Pacific actually has that other parts of the world may not actually be challenged with, and actually some of the aspects of a linear economy, particularly things like plastic in our ocean, they actually can have such a greater impact on the Pacific than they may have in other parts. You've got a lot of the Pacific Island nations that their entire economic wealth welfare is actually reliant on the fishing industry. So it's not just about, sort of ocean, sort of the ocean, ocean quality or even food security. It's actually economic security for some of these nations. So there was a fantastic day spent in New Zealand talking about sort of, the opportunity it has and this sort of step change needed. And I think my takeaway message from it was that to me, a lot of the time we talk about the waste aspect of a circular economy or reusing materials, but when you think about it through the lens of the Maori society, you actually really understand the regenerative opportunities that a circular economy will bring. So for instance, like they're actively seeking out economic opportunity that provides employment to their youth. They want to plant things that will only regenerate soils, not just strip. So it's a really, really interesting space. So watch that, and it would be amazing to see it sort of flow over to Australia. And then, as I said, China, who are, they really are leading the way. Last year, the Chinese government and the EU signed a memorandum of understanding with regard to embedding circular economy principles into all they do, and particularly with the focus for circular cities. So when you look to circular cities, they have 5 key targets with regard to it, and the first is the built environment. So they want to be designing buildings to be sort of modular, shareable, and reusable. And then but they're also looking at things like mobility. They are looking to nutrition, obviously a huge issue for the Chinese with the largest population in the world. Textiles, and one of the largest manufacturers of textiles, so they already are doing a lot of textile sharing, textile use. They have and electronics. And the Chinese government have essentially said that it can actually save the Chinese population up to $10 trillion by 2040 by adopting circular principles into the design and functionality of their cities. So that's some of the it's sort of around the savings that they believe they will have. So when we look at sort of their vision for, so when we actually focus down around the built environment for China and what are the opportunities. So it's they have 6 core principles. So the first one is actually designing for longevity. So this is actually really embedding things like modular design and flexible design into the original design. So not designing something for a 25-year life when you can actually design by sort of thinking of its multiple uses for a longer period, and understanding what materials you will use and how is that going to impact your use of that building. Industrializing construction processes. So by 2026, China actually wants to have 30% of its buildings prefabricated. So actually not, and also they're really pursuing the whole 3D printing space. They are probably leading the way in that space. Utilising space. So as I said earlier, we actually know we're using about 40% of our buildings. So they're driving an awful lot of policy and opportunities with regard to utilising space and doing that whole sort of sharing space economy. Improving energy efficiency through green buildings. They're actually, they're doing really well on this. They're kind of leading the way on this in some of the major Chinese cities already, but sort of it's expanding that. Enhancing productivity with smart buildings. This is using things like smart meters, matching, optimizing activities to energy efficiency, thinking about is there an opportunity to think about when you're doing things at what time. And then finally, it's actually, they obviously recognize that the construction and demolition sector produce, obviously are the biggest users of raw materials, therefore they potentially can generate the most waste. So therefore, how do they actually look at basically making sure that material stays in the cycle as long as possible? So finally, and I think we heard this very, very loud and clear, particularly from the industry session this morning, going back to, looping back to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, and, obviously UN, the goal 12, is, sort of consumable production and consumption, is embedded into the circular economy. But really, actually, probably fundamentally more important is the encouraging partnership and working together, because if we work together, we have an opportunity to sort of achieve so much more. Okay, thank you.